Thank you. Contrary to what you might think, neither the pedicab nor the Prius would make the greenest taxi cab. While climate change is at the forefront of everybody's minds and reducing tailpipe emissions that contribute to it seems like a perfectly reasonable solution, the right solution to this problem is going to involve finding the most appropriate technology, which is not necessarily the newest or fanciest technology. You're welcome. So, why New York City? It's the largest fleet of taxi cabs in the country with over 13,000 vehicles. By comparison, Seattle has 650. It's also one of the most regulated fleets in the country. What happens in New York City tends to influence what happens in the rest of the country, including with taxi cabs. Taxi cabs in New York are replaced every 3 to 5 years. If they make it that long, after 240,000 miles, they might wind up in a smaller city as a taxi cab. If you haven't taken a cab in New York City, you may have ridden in a New York City taxi cab. Taxi cabs are green already. They're green for small reasons, like proper tire inflation, regular maintenance, and 3 times annual emissions inspection in New York, but also for big reasons. They take private vehicles off the street. In New York, they transport 1 million people a day. 1 million people a day. And we can compare that with the New York City subway system, which transports 6.5 million people a day, and the bus system, which transports 2.4 million people a day. So they're a vital part of a mass transportation infrastructure. But before we talk about how we can make cabs greener, we need to take a look at some of the vehicles that have been used as cabs in the past. The Checker Marathon was introduced in 1961, and for 20 years, the design of this vehicle barely changed. This made the maintenance of it very inexpensive, because parts from one model year could be used on the next model year, and the next model year, and the next. The cabs were essentially recycled on the very lot that they drove off of. After the Checker Marathon was discontinued, the Chevy Caprice replaced it. Unlike the Marathon, it was not a purpose-built taxi cab, but it was a fleet vehicle and similarly didn't change much from model year to model year. I know so much about this because that's my dad and my grandfather started a taxi cab business. Crown Victorias replaced the Chevy Caprice in the 90s and have continued to be one of the most popular vehicles, but they're about to be discontinued themselves. So the question here is not whether to maintain the status quo of V8 gas guzzlers that get 12 miles a gallon, but what will replace them. In 2005, there was an experiment to use the London cab, which is a purpose-built taxi cab, but it couldn't withstand the beating that New York City streets doled out to it. So can we make bright green taxi cabs? Can we increase fuel efficiency, decrease the tailpipe emissions, maintain safety and comfort of the driver and the passenger without adding too much to the sticker price or maintenance costs? That's really the question here. These are the vehicles that New York City has approved as taxi cabs. As you can see, most of them are hybrids. The problem with hybrids is that all of them are basically too expensive. Prices start in the mid-20s and go up to the 40s. As you can see, a bunch of these are also SUVs. And the SUVs that have been run as cabs in New York City so far aren't getting the gas mileage to justify the additional cost. There's also the problem of consumer demand. As it increases for hybrids, the availability for taxi cabs decreases. There are questions about the long-term durability of these vehicles. New York City cabs run for 12 hours to 22 hours a day, 80,000 miles a year, and life cycle of the batteries. So we can look for technologies that already exist that aren't new technologies and make cabs that are not hybrids be bright green. The cab doesn't have to be a hybrid to be bright green. There are purpose-built vehicles that are being introduced right now, like the Ford Transit Connect, which is based on a vehicle that has been sold and manufactured in Europe for many years now. The Transit Connect that you see here is a 4-cylinder, 2.0-liter gasoline engine. It's tested at 22 miles a gallon city, 25 miles a gallon highway. It's simple tested technology. Mechanics know how to work on it, the parts are cheap, maintenance is cheap, and the car is cheap, $22,000 a year. Added benefit of this vehicle is that Ford plans to introduce both an electric plug-in vehicle, 100% electric, as well as clean diesel models in the next few years. A purpose-built taxi cab using tested technology will be the greenest cab, not necessarily a hybrid vehicle. So I want to thank everybody for your attention. I want to thank people on Flickr whose pictures I used. I want to thank my family who's been in the cab business for 30 years. You can follow me on Twitter, @Gregory Heller, and you can find out more about me at gregoryheller.com.